Conversations That Matter is a partner program for the Centre for Dialogue at Simon Fraser University. The production of this program is made possible thanks to the support of the following and viewers like you.
Michael Geller, welcome.
It's nice to be back.
It's an interesting time in the real estate market here in the Lower Mainland, in Vancouver in particular. The level of emotion that has been swirling around rising prices has led to, as Jeff Plant put it, a little bit of jealousy, maybe a little xenophobia, a little overreaction. Where are we at from your perspective as far as affordability? The government's reacted both at the provincial level and the city level. Are we really in a housing crisis? Are prices really out of control?
I think we really are in a housing crisis. I use the word crisis, and I think prices have been out of control. I think we're going to have to wait and see whether or not, like most commodities where prices go up and they sometimes come down, whether that's going to happen. But there's no doubt that we are out of whack with most North American and even international cities when it comes to the cost of housing.
A year ago, I was at a presentation where Finance Minister Mike de Jong was talking about how foolhardy it would be of the government to interfere in the housing market. And here we are less than 12 months later, and they've gone and done exactly that. Is what they've done, is it a wise move?
The notion of trying to tax foreign buyers is not in itself unwise. The way they went about it, I thought, was very unwise and was quite shocking, but it just shows how emotion and political considerations can often dominate common sense.
Well, I think emotion is the key word there. It has really driven a reaction from both the provincial and the city government. And they've reacted in ways that sometimes that I find myself thinking, okay, is that practical? Is it practical to impose a vacancy tax on homes, whether it's a condo or a single family home?
Many other places have tried to impose vacancy taxes. They have one in Israel, in Jerusalem. They tried it, but we don't know yet how effective it's going to be. England, they want a number of the counties, encouraged by Boris Johnson, to impose these taxes. And I did go to England and asked about it, and it became known as the table and chairs tax, because as soon as someone was notified that their suite was vacant and they would be taxed higher, they brought in some tables and chairs and said, you see, it's occupied. So I don't think anybody should put any hope in the City of Vancouver's proposed vacant housing tax. It may on the margins generate a little bit of revenue, but it's not going to have any significant impact.
Okay, so we've established that there is a housing crisis, one, to be able to afford to buy, and then also on the rental side. There are so many people, especially people who are at the early stages of their career, who are going, well, there isn't rental housing, and what there is, I can't afford. Yeah. How do we start to change the situation? If we acknowledge that there is a housing shortage, particularly in the city of Vancouver, what are some practical steps that we can take to start to alleviate that?
Okay. People mock the notion that we need to increase supply. But in fact, that's one of the things we need to do. We need to increase supply, and we also need to increase competition. Because as long as you've got a commodity that's scarce, you can put the prices up. And so that's the first thing. So then the question is, well, how do we do that? People immediately assume that if you're going to increase supply, it means there's high-rises coming. And I think that's wrong. Although for years I used to try and get approvals for high-rises, I actually am concerned about many of the tall buildings coming into Vancouver and other municipalities. In many instances, I actually think they are too big. But there's a lot of housing that I'll call in between, something in between the single-family house and the high-rise apartment that we should be building much more of. And it's everything from duplexes and townhouses along all the arterials. Is there any reason why we shouldn't say all the arterial streets in Metro Vancouver should be allowed to be developed with townhouses and small apartments like they were 50, 60 years ago? That would be one suggestion. The other thing we should be doing is looking at opportunities to do more intensive development. I know a lot of people said, look, I don't want to move into a townhouse. I don't want a stacked townhouse. I'd like a small house We don't build small houses. I grew up in a small house. That's what we built after World War II. So why don't we
They
take
were a
some
Vancouver special, weren't they?
Vancouver specials,
Yeah.
and all across Canada, post-World War, CMHC, bungalows, 1.5-story houses. We need to start building smaller houses, and we could do that easily. Why don't we take a lot of these corner lots and divide them into two? Instead of having a fence along the flanking street, have another little house that fronts onto that street. And yes, you have to address the parking, but you can do that. The other thing I feel we should be doing is affordable basement suites. That's probably the most affordable type of housing.
But that has been a hot button issue for decades now.
And yet now we've come to accept it. Even in West Vancouver, where I've been doing some work, West Vancouver is accepting legalized basement suites. But you know, it's interesting. You can have a basement suite in a single family house, but you can't have one in a duplex, and you can't have one in a row house. And yet, when you do go to Europe and you walk along those streets, you see the lower level, maybe it was the maid's quarters at one time, that's affordable accommodation. There's a lot of little things like this that I think could increase supply.
In some cases, you're just talking about competing legislation. It's a slight change of a rule that takes this piece of property and says, now you can add a suite to it.
Yes. And in fact, the one thing the City of Vancouver has done, which I compliment them for, is say basically every single family lot can have 3 dwellings. It can have the main house, it can have a basement suite, and it can have a laneway house. Now, the basement suite and the laneway house have to be rental. Although interestingly enough, a lot of people are actually buying those laneway houses, and they're even buying the basement suites, and they're doing it through complex legal agreements.
As a strata?
They're basically not as a strata, as through something known as a tenants in common legal arrangement, where you essentially own a share of the property. But I say, why don't we legalize this now? Make it easier. A young lawyer was at my house last night. Her husband's in real estate. They can't afford anything other than building a laneway house in her mother's backyard in Point Grey. And she will work out a legal structure so she can own it. I think we should make it easier for people to do that.
Just got to get you to hang on for a second while we take a quick commercial break. We'll be right back.
Conversations That Matter is a not-for-profit program made possible thanks to the charitable support of the following and from viewers like you. Please visit conversationsthatmatter.tv and help us to continue to produce this program.
So that gives them opportunity to have equity, to build their own portfolio, and have certainty as well.
And in this case, what they will do, and I think this is a pattern that could affect many households, they will move into the laneway house for the next few years, and when the mother is ready to move from the big house, she'll move into the laneway house, and her children, hopefully with a young family, will then move into the big house.
It's a complete change of thinking that we need to, I guess, embrace, because for so long in the city of Vancouver, the dream was that you could have a single family residence. What is going to happen to that dream? Is it over now?
Well, there's no doubt that it's not over for a lot of people, and they're going to do extraordinary things. One extraordinary thing people are doing is they're driving to Chilliwack and Abbotsford every day so they can have a single family house out there. In fact, we often joke, if you can't afford housing in Vancouver, just keep driving until you can. But the other thing that I do worry about is something else that's happened in England. I was at a pub a little while back, and Thursday night it was very busy. I asked a young lady, is it always like this? She said, yes, but especially on Thursday. I said, well, why not Friday? Oh, she said, people go home on Friday. I said, what do you mean? She said, they live 3-4 hours from London. They have to work in the city, but they want that single family house or affordable housing, so they commute weekly. And they share a bed sitter with some of their colleagues from work. And I wrote a column about this in the Courier, and people said, what do you mean it's going to happen one day? It's happening now. People are commuting from Nanaimo, people are commuting from further up the coast, so it's interesting.
I had coffee with an old colleague who is now working for the BBC in London. I said, so where in London do you live? He goes, I don't live in London, I work for the BBC. He says, I live in Bristol.
Yes.
Huh? Well, then how do you go to work? I drive in on Sunday night, drive home Thursday night. Just exactly what you were saying. And he was just sharing basically a bedroom.
And so I think that there will always be people who want to live that single family dream, and they will go to extraordinary lengths. But I hope we don't get to the point in Metro Vancouver where people are so completely forced out. Now, one way of dealing with that, I think, is just offering better alternatives. Again, a lot of people I know say, I don't really get the choice that I would like, so they'll sell their house. The other thing is, I often am interested, where are the people in Kerrisdale who are selling their houses, or in any other affluent metro neighborhood? Where do they move? And do you know where they often move? They move to Langley, they move to Surrey. Not because that's where the butcher shop is that they've always patronized for years, that's where their grandchildren are, because their kids can't afford anymore to live in Kerrisdale or Dunbar. So there's another pattern there. But what I hope we can start to do, we need to change our zoning so we can start making better use of the land we've already got.
So you talk a lot about fill-in housing. What exactly do you mean by fill-in housing? Because it seems that it has many hues of the same shade.
So in West Vancouver, across the road from West Van United Church, one block off Marine Drive, next to the rec center.
There's that new row of houses right there, yeah.
There used to be 3 single-family houses there. And I was introduced to that property. Someone tried for 4 years to get it changed. He wanted to build some duplexes and some coach houses for sale. And he couldn't get approval. And I was invited to initially review his plans, and eventually I ended up taking over that development. And I built those 9 houses. Now, it had to go to City Council. It was a 4-3 vote. It took a long time to get approved. Some very prominent West Vancouver residents even wrote letters opposing it. But now that it's been finished and people can see it, they say this is exactly what many of us want. And I'm hoping that that development will encourage a lot more like it. And indeed, not everybody wants to live on the main street, but one block off the main street could be perfect.
So what are some of the components of that development? Not that I want to go around necessarily promoting your development, but I happened to, by chance, walk by it about 2 weeks ago and went, huh, that's new. And there are all these houses, like they butt right up against one another, but it's clear that they're individual dwellings.
That's right. They're individually owned. Even the coach houses. They were the first legal coach houses in West Vancouver after years of talking about coach houses. But I was born in England, and in England you go along the back lanes, which are often called the mews, and that becomes a whole secondary street. Kids play out there, there's homes fronting on there, and it's not just in England. In Germany, in Holland, in Denmark, you see the same thing.
This is our second break. We'll be back in a moment.
Conversations That Matter is a not-for-profit program made possible thanks to the charitable support of the following and from viewers like you. Please visit conversationsthatmatter.tv and help us to continue to produce this program.
So I start thinking about, okay, so many of the neighborhoods in Vancouver where there might be 10, 12 feet between houses right now. Are you suggesting that in some of those neighborhoods that there be a block of homes that I guess will be demolished to make room for more housing in the same space, but that there would be no border between the two properties?
Yes, I think that you could say, the first thing you have to do is get rid of this approach we have now, where basically if I want to go and build some duplexes in a coach house, I have to go through a lengthy rezoning process. I think the way we need to do it is to have the community and the planners have a consultation and decide, how about along all the arterials we can have maybe up to 3 stories or 4 stories, and then when we get to the main intersections we can go up to 6 stories, and then one block off the arterials we can have 2-story and 2.5-story townhouses.
But with borderless properties.
With borderless properties, noting that in the beginning, for the next 20 years, there'll be detached houses, and then next door there'll be some row houses, maybe 4 little row houses. But the point is, over time, those areas will slowly redevelop. And it could actually happen in a less disruptive way than if you look along Cambie Street. I don't know if you've been down Cambie Street now. It's quite alarming and for many people.
There are whole sections there that are being redeveloped right at the
completely
moment.
redeveloped, and quite a dramatic change. Now, I happen to think it's a good thing overall, but I'd like to see us do a lot more of that, because there are many people who no longer, if they had a good choice, they would get rid of their single-family house. Here's another thought. Many people say, I don't want to move into a townhouse because I don't want to live in a condominium. I don't want to have to deal with a strata council. You hear that at parties all the time. Most of the row houses in the rest of the world aren't part of a condominium. They're individually owned. And you have a
with
party
title
wall,
to that.
title to your own land, and a party wall agreement with your neighbor. And if you want to paint your door red, or if you want to do some planning in the garden, or you want to fix up the outside and paint the brick, you can. And yet and for years it was very difficult to do that legally in Metro Vancouver. You can make, the government changed the law about 4 years ago. It's much easier to do it. And yet developers are not yet building individually owned row houses because people are buying the other ones. But there's a housing choice that I know would appeal to a lot of people.
So there's this perception that we are running out of land in Vancouver. Yet, just last week, I went for an incredibly long walk up Ontario Street, right down to the Fraser River. Off of Ontario near 33rd, there is this huge stretch of land that's all fenced off. Nothing there. And no sense right at the moment that it's being developed. So there's opportunities like that. I saw industrial land down south of Southwest Marine Drive, empty. So there is a tremendous amount of opportunity. I keep hearing that the delay in developing so many of these things isn't that people don't want to develop them, but they can't get through the process at City Hall.
Well, the big property in Maine and Ontario near 33rd is a special case. That was the first public housing project in British Columbia. It was called Little Mountain. The province sold it. It put it up for sale in 2007.
So it's been sitting vacant?
A developer bought it. He paid a lot of money for it. The same developer is doing the Trump Tower. He paid a lot of money and then wanted to get a lot more development than most of the community really wanted to see on that land. And so that is a very special situation, although recently that did get approved by City Council, so there will be a lot of new housing going there. But you've raised you raised an excellent point about all that industrial land. Now, if you think about the nicest neighborhoods in Vancouver, the South Shore of False Creek, the North Shore of False Creek, Cole Harbour, Steveston and Richmond, New Westminster waterfront, that was all once industrial land.
It was all industrial.
And it's been changed to housing. It's wonderful, wonderful communities, but there is a concern, and it's a legitimate concern, that if we lose all the industrial land, then we won't have places for the jobs. And so now we've gone the other way. You can't touch industrial land. I actually think many of these industrial parks and large industrial sites would be wonderful places for housing. You could put it on the roofs of these single-story buildings, or you could put it around some of these. Now, not everywhere, because some of those businesses are pretty noisy and so forth. But I think we can start to change our attitude that we could have better mixed uses on that industrial land.
Fascinating topic, but we got to take one last break. We'll be right back.
Conversations That Matter is a not-for-profit program made possible thanks to the charitable support of the following and from viewers like you. Please visit conversationsthatmatter.tv and help us to continue to produce this program.
Okay, so industrial land, laneway housing, coaching, filling in spaces and so on. What about modular housing? What's the opportunity that exists there, and is it something that we can actually embrace here in Vancouver?
Well, you've obviously watched one of the talks I gave at SFU because I did my thesis at the School of Architecture 45 years ago on the idea of using modular housing. It's not that common here, but in Europe it's very common. And the idea is you build the housing in the factory, you truck it to the site, but there's all sorts of opportunities. One of the ideas I had is so often you'll see vacant parking lots or vacant areas. Why not use them, if only temporarily, like school portables? You know how they build these portables and eventually they replace them with permanent housing. Why don't we do the same thing with modular housing? And if you go to Europe, even Toronto, you can see modular housing now being built on the rooftops of existing buildings because it's like creating new land. We have to become a little more imaginative, I think, in terms of how we make better use of our land.
So if we increase supply, it's going to stabilize prices. It might even bring them down. What do you say to somebody who's been a current house owner or a homeowner watching their number one asset in life going up and then going, but I don't like what you're doing because you're affecting me and my asset?
And I think that's exactly what motivated the provincial government, is taking a hands-off attitude for the last couple of years. But meanwhile, we watch prices go. You go and ask most of those people who bought that house for $56,000, did you ever think it'd be worth 3.2 as a little piece of a 50-foot by 120-foot lot? No, of course they didn't.
Vancouver special.
That's right.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that is the dilemma. But if we really want homes to come down in price, then I think we do have to recognize that there will be some adjustments in price. But I think a better approach is to say, all right, maybe the single family dream will always be a multi-million-dollar dream if you're in the city of Vancouver. But there's thousands of townhouses and duplexes and what we call semi-detached. And for younger people, townhouses above townhouses. I was in Montreal last week, where everyone who's been to Montreal has seen those little buildings with the winding staircase. Interestingly, they have a lot more snow there, and yet they still live that way, but it's more affordable. But the other thing is, why don't we replace some of those single-family houses with little 6-suiter and 8-suiter apartment buildings, the kind of apartment buildings that we built 50 and 60 years ago? The answer, by the way, is because our building codes basically prevent you from building those in a cost-effective way.
So it's going to take some creative envisioning from people who make decisions around bylaws and govern that process. How likely are we to see that happen?
Oh, I think we're increasingly likely. And it's not because I'm just a naive optimist, but
optimists aren't naive, by the way.
Necessity is the mother of invention. I think this forthcoming election, provincial election, will be about housing affordability. A year and a half from now, in November, the next municipal elections will all be around housing affordability. And while, yes, some politicians can say we brought in this investment tax and we brought in a vacant tax, they're recognizing they have to do more.
They have to do real on-the-ground work and changing legislation that will make development possible.
That's right. I just got an invitation from Rich Coleman's office to attend a workshop that's being held in September. And I really believe now that this is more than just saying, oh, look, we're doing something about it. I think there really is a genuine desire to say, what can we do? The other thing is, for so long, the people who oppose many of these development ideas, they're now the ones seeking the housing choices. And I always remember I did an apartment building in Point Grey, and a lady came up to me and she was saying she'd like something above the 6th floor. And I said, it's all sold. And she said, it's so funny. For 40 years, my husband and I have been active in Kitsilano, fighting any high rises. And now that we're ready to move into one, we can't find one.
And I wonder why. Mr. Geller, thank you very much.
Thank you.